So we start our last chapter in Hamilton, The Word in the Book. And she makes a brief reference, this won't be on the quiz or anything, to Bhartṛhari. But just to, I think it's interesting just to say something about Bhartṛhari, the grammarian, who, just to get a sense of how variegated the Indian intellectual traditions were. Again, we've sort of compartmentalized them into 6 schools, and I've said repeatedly that's a myth. There were so many different intellectual expressions, and here's a fascinating one, because for Bhartrahari, actually, I'll be getting to Shankara in this very lecture, the monist Shankara. For Bhartrahari, all reality is really monistic. It comes from Brahman. Brahman, this reality is nothing other than an expression of Brahman, a manifestation of Brahman. But what makes him, of course, all Vedantins are going to say that, as we will see in a minute, later in the lecture. But what makes Bhartrahari interesting is that for him, Brahman is Om, sonic, the sound Om. Okay, we're going to read in the Upanishads. We'll start the Upanishadic section after today. And we'll be reading some of the Upanishads which say things like that, say that Brahman, all this is Om. And there's a whole Upanishad dedicated to Om. So therefore, in a sense, all reality is vibrational. You could think of it that way if you wanted to use kind of a modern term from physics. But actually that's also a Sanskrit term, spanda, vibration. From this primordial Om emanate the phonemes, the aksharas of the Sanskrit alphabet. And there are 40 something. Ka ka ga ga nga, cha 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 nya, ta ta da da na, ta ta da da na, pa pa ba ba ma, and then ya ra la va semivowels, ha, and this is the Sanskrit alphabet. Very scientific, starts off 5 sounds coming from the throat, gutturals, then up to the palatal, very scientifically arranged, not like English where the alphabet's all over the place. And then we have the vowels, a, e, u, r, ri, lr, lri, a, I, o, ow. All of these are aksharas. These are, we call them phonemes in linguistics. So these are kind of like the fracturing of Om into the letters of the Sanskrit alphabet. Okay, so the Sanskrit language is a divine language from the point of view of Bhartrahari. So therefore, and then these sort of sounds come together and they form words. And the words are eternal, because remember, he's coming in the tradition that the Vedas are eternal, and the Veda consists of words. So that means if the Vedas are eternal, their words are eternal. And if the words are eternal, the reference to the words are eternal. So if the Vedas say, place rice into the sacrificial fire, that means there is a real rice, and there is a real fire. And the word rice is eternally, because the Vedas are eternal, eternally connected. It's not human made. Language is not humanly produced. So the Mimamsa would argue this. They would say we see no origin for language. We never see, it's just been handed down from time immemorial. There's no reference in any text to anybody inventing language, so therefore we have no reason to suppose that it's humanly composed, and other reasons. That's not a very sophisticated reason, but other intellectual reasons for why the Vedas are eternal. So anyway, coming back to Bhartrahari, so then for him, so that means then, so the Sanskrit language, because after all, the Vedas are written in Sanskrit, so that means the Sanskrit language is eternal. So now you have the phonemes of the alphabet coming together into words, and then the words eternally connected to their reference, and then words coming together into sentences and revealing higher meaning, right? Because a word just is limited in its meaning, right? Fire, you have some sense of what fire is, but you have fire what? What about fire? So when words come together in sentences, you have larger units of meaning. Now, and for Bhartrahari, thinking, all human thought takes place or consists of language. There's no thinking is linguistic. We think in words and concepts. So we have like a mental version of what we say. So since human thinking is linguistic or language, so that means correct understanding for him, correct understanding of grammar and sentence construction and word meaning and all the ingredients of good language, it constitutes correct thinking and good thinking. Remember, thinking is made of Sanskrit language, which is made of Sanskrit phonemes, which are expressions of Om. So he takes the next step. It's a very interesting step, which is to say that by studying Sanskrit grammar, because all of these schools are going to say, okay, to know Brahman, the mind has to be purified, right? It has to be purified from its ignorance, from the things which block its ability to see reality purely and truly. Okay, things like desire and anger and hatred and lust. These things divert thought away from the contemplation and the ability to perceive deeper levels of reality, and divert it into trivial, superficial activities in the world and perception of the world. So therefore the mind has to be purified of lust and greed and anger. All these traditions, philosophy is not just abstract thinking. That philosophy takes place in the mind. And for the mind to perceive truths, the mind has to be pure, because if the mind is in a afflicted state, a person might be very intellectual, very intelligent, but would not have the ability to perceive deep level truths. So therefore morality, in the Indian philosophical traditions, is inextricably connected with philosophy. Right? In the West, it doesn't matter where your morals are. You could be, Kant, Hegel. In fact, if you study the lives of some of these Western philosophers, they weren't very nice people. But some of them had all kinds of scandals and, morally questionable occurrences in their life and behaviors. But it's irrelevant. When we think of these great philosophers, we don't examine their lifestyles. We examine what they have to say. Indian philosophy is not like that. And the reason it's not like that is because to think correctly, the mind has to be in a clear state. And then clarity means that it's not clustered with ignorant, desire-laden, lustful, and delusional thoughts. This will become clearer when we look at yoga psychology. So I don't want to get too much into this now. I want to stick with Bhartrahari, but just to make the general point that the state of the mind, rather than content of philosophy, the state of the mind within which philosophy takes place is very important, not just to the Hindu traditions, Buddhist too. So therefore, in order to be, and remember, the goal of philosophy is not just abstract thinking, but to perceive the truth. Darshana. Remember the term darshana. Darshana means to see, from drish in Sanskrit, to see the truth. So philosophy is an activity, the ultimate goal of which is to have some kind of a perception, or at least the highest goal of which, the ultimate goal of which, yes, that is the highest goal, to have some kind of perception of the Atman, of the true metaphysical nature of the world. Of course, all the schools differ as to what that is, but they do agree that a pure mind is a requisite of this, and so they have their practices, mantras, and various kinds of practices that we'll look at when we do yoga, because yoga is about the practices that lead to the grand finale experience, vision of truth, vision of the Atman, perception, direct perception, not just philosophizing. Back to Bhartrahari then, for him, the study of Sanskrit is one of these practices that purifies the mind, because given that Sanskrit is a divine language, it's the eternal language of the Vedas. It's not constructed by a human. It's aparushaya. Okay, so which makes it perfect. It's not, well, at least it makes it not subject to the defects inherent in all kind of human activity. So therefore, language is so the study of Sanskrit itself, by studying the sentences of Sanskrit, then and very intensely and purely and with this intention in mind. Remember, Om is sort of vibrating underneath the syllables which combine to make words, which then combine to make sentences, which then produce meaning. And underneath all of this is the primordial Om, which is the sonic vibrational expression of Brahman. And as a monist, he believes that Atman and Brahman are one and the same. They're one, they merge. Okay, we'll be talking a lot more about that in just a minute when we get to Vedanta. So, in some ways, actually, it would have been better. I mean, I'm doing Bhartrahari first because she has it first in the book, but it would have been better to have Bhartrahari at the end of this chapter. But no worries, not to worry. He's not going to be on your quiz, but but fascinating. It just gives us a sense of the richness and the scope of Indian philosophy and the various methods and ways by which one can perceive truth and strive for truth. Not just one way. It's not just one kind of, this is the only way. So even by studying Sanskrit, then the grammarians, certainly Bhartrahari, the school of Bhartrahari, believed that the mind became purified, and as the mind becomes purified, and then eventually the Sanskrit words and sentences and words and phonemes at a certain point dissolve and reveal their underlying substructure, which is nothing other than Om. Okay, and one realizes one's unity with Om. And then that is everything the Vedanta says. That is experience as an eternal, blissful, infinite experience. Because Om is infinite, and it pervades all reality. So it's infinite, it's eternal, right? Veda is eternal, Om is eternal. So it's infinite, it's eternal, but it's also blissful. So, and that's the goal of life. That's the sort of the bliss that we seek. So, but to get there, right, the Vedantins are going to say something similar. But what's unique and very interesting about Bhartrahari is for him, the Sanskrit language itself is the method or a method to attain that. Okay, so enough of Bhartrahari, very interesting. And then we'll move, and then she says a few more things about the Vedas. Again, we know that the Mimamsa school is arguing that the Vedas are eternal. They're the ritualists. They're trying to perpetuate the Vedic ritual. And, of course, it's coming under attack from Buddhists, from others. In the late Vedic period, the devotional traditions are emerging, the theistic traditions, Ishvara-centered traditions. Bhakti is undermining caste. In Bhakti, it doesn't matter what your caste is, whether you're a Brahman or a warrior or a Sudra or the lowest caste or an outcast. It doesn't matter. Krishna says in the Gita, it doesn't matter. All can attain me. Brahmane, what does he say? Vaishya, Striyo Eva, they can anyone, any sort of the lower castes, doesn't matter your gender, women, men, all can attain me. So therefore, Bhakti in many ways sweeps away the caste restrictions. But remember, the Vedic ritual is in the preserve of the male Brahmana caste. Just trying to remember the verse. Yepi syu papayona yaha. Striyo vaishyastata sudras tepi yanti param gatim. Krishna says, doesn't matter if they're sinful, not sinful, what caste they are, male, female. They can all come to this, they all attain the supreme destination in bhakti. Not so Vedic ritualism. You have to be male Brahmana, and therefore the ritual was being preserved in the Brahmana caste. So, okay, so moving just a few words about Mimamsa, and so they're perpetuating the ritual, and why, on what authority, given that there are these movements away now. Buddhism is not not interested in Vedic ritualism. They're interested in nirvana and liberation, and definitely they're not rejecting Brahmanism. In fact, many of the early Buddhists were Brahmins, we know from their names. So there wasn't a conflict, by the way. It's a very interesting question. When did Buddhism actually become a distinct tradition? It's not clear. It's about centuries. When was there a sense of self between either Buddhists or Brahmins? When was there a sense of othering the others? When did the Buddhists the Brahmins and the Brahmins other the Buddhists? Buddhists say, no, that we're not them. They're not us. They're not following what we're following. On both sides. When did that come? Not for many centuries. After the Buddha, it's clear that many of the Buddha's disciples and interlocutors were Brahmins. They continued with their Brahmin activities. And even this whole thing about there not being a soul. I just read an article last night. A scholar went through all of the early dialogues of the Buddha, and he looked at the ones where he's communicating with the Brahmins. And he's not preaching to them there is no Atman, there's only momentary interdependent flow of consciousness. He never says that. In fact, in all of the early dialogues with the Brahmins, I think only 7% even mention the notion of anatman, that there is not an eternal Atman. So that wasn't the central feature of Buddhism vis-a-vis Brahmanism. So it could very well be the case that many Buddhist Brahmins also had some notion of Upanishadic Atman. They didn't necessarily subscribe to the non-Atman idea. So it seems like some of the Buddhist practices were feature more in the early, like mindfulness and so forth. Anyway, that's a side comment. So the Mimamsas are trying to keep the old rituals going, right? Buddhists are not performing them anymore. Jains not performing those rituals. Bhakti traditions moving away. Vaishnavism, Shaivism. And so the question would be then, well, why should we follow these rituals? What grounds are we following these rituals? And of course, the Mimamsa, the main position is, well, we do that because they're in the Vedas. Well, why should we follow the Vedas? Would be the next question then. Who cares about these old Vedas? So the Mimamsa then, in order to bestow authority on the Vedas, such that whatever is contained in the Vedas should be followed, right? That's the point. The ritual is contained in the Vedas. The Vedas say perform rituals. And that's why Mimamsa is saying we perform rituals, because the Vedas tell us to do so. Well, why should we follow the Vedas? Well, they're eternal. So part of their argument is to show why eternal, because if they were humanly written, then they would be imperfect. They'd be subject to the imperfections of any human. And they could be critiqued, like the Buddha was a human. So you can critique Buddhist philosophy. And clearly Hindus did in later times, and Buddhists critiqued each other in the different schools. But if something is eternal, it doesn't come under it's not imperfect. It's not subject to the imperfections. And the term for that is apaurusheya. It is not written by a human. So they had to then, so they developed very sophisticated, that sounds like a simplistic argument. Oh, the Vedas are eternal, therefore we have to follow it. But actually, that may be simplistic when it's pitched like that. But they developed very, very sophisticated epistemological, arguments. Epistemology is how do we know something. So the Mimamsas want to say that how do we know that we should perform these rituals, right? On what epistemology is that based? So it's based on right, how do we know things? Let's say there's three, let's start off with three ways of knowing that most traditions accept, right? The sense perception. We know things because we perceive things. That's one way of knowing, right? I'm looking at my garden out here, and therefore I believe I know it exists. And then we make inferences. So we say wherever there is smoke, there is fire. I see smoke over there. We'll be discussing these in greater detail. We'll probably mention them in past lectures. Wherever there is smoke, I see smoke over there. I infer there's a fire. I don't see the fire, but I see the smoke. I make an inference. Second way of knowing inferences. The third is words. Most of our knowledge we get from words. So the Mimamsas want to argue, so that's a valid form of knowledge, right? From the minute we're born, we receive information from our parents. We go to school. Right now, you're getting information from words, right? You're assuming that I'm an authority in some sort of way. You're making an inference, actually, that I know what I'm talking about. That's an inference. I hope it's a valid one. So, but words are a valid form of knowledge. So the Vedas are words. So they develop very sophisticated arguments as to why words must be reliable unless proven otherwise. And they would say something like, why do you doubt words of what grounds do you have to doubt the words of the Vedas? If you say something like, and they would say, you don't doubt, and if someone were to say, well, prove it. Prove the words of the Vedas. Then someone like Kumarila, a Mimamsa theologian, would say, well, how can you prove? Why do you just challenge the words of the Veda and demand proof that they are accurate and authoritative and reliable, and therefore that we should follow them? Why do you just challenge that? Why not challenge sense perception? On what grounds can we prove, other than sense perception itself, which is circular reasoning, on what grounds can we prove that what we see is real or authoritative? How do I know for sure that there is a garden out there that I'm looking at? other than sense perception itself. But besides sense perception, what means do I have? If you say, well, someone else's sense perception, well, that's circular. Well, then how do I know that sense perception is accurate? Remember, there are the Yogacara Buddhists who actually will challenge the notion of an external world and say, well, how do you know that? Maybe it's all a mental construction. So given that you can, so where are we going with this? What's the argument? What's the Mimamsa epistemological, right? How do we know something? How do we know, in this case, how do we know the words of the Vedas are reliable? Would say, just as you cannot verify sense perception except by sense perception itself, how else do you know that sense perception is justified and valid and an authentic way of knowing other than by sense perception itself, which is a circular. There's no way outside of sense perception. There's no other means of knowledge other than sense perception to justify the validity of sense perception. So in the same way, if that's the case, and we don't challenge sense perception, we just assume if we see something, it's valid, unless some other later sense perception disproves it. But only within sense perception can it be disproved. So I see a snake, I think it's a snake, and then later on, and this is a famous example that will be used in a different way later on in the lecture, in Advaita Vedanta. I see a snake, and I believe I see a snake, but later on, and because it's a bit dark, and I take my glasses off, my eyes are not too good, whatever reason, believe I see a snake, but later on, but then I go up to it and I realize, oh, it's just a rope. So now my secondary sense perception disproves the first sense perception. But that's sense perception disproving sense perception. Therefore, the authority of sense perception remains within the episteme, the means of knowing, the epistemology of sense perception. You can't step outside of sense perception. There's no way of stepping outside of sense perception to demonstrate the sense perception is accurate. Now, where's all this going? Because they want to say the same thing about the words of the Vedas. Words are another way of knowing. Why do you challenge unless there's reason to challenge, unless there's any reason, there's no reason to challenge, how do you know the Vedic rituals don't work? What makes you think they don't work? The sacrifice may not work immediately, but it will produce its fruits in time. And therefore, just as there's no way of challenging the reliability of sense perception except through sense perception, there's no way of challenging the reliability of the words of the Vedas, because they are they're not written by humans. They are a source of knowledge, and you can't step outside of them, and you can't disprove them with other sources of knowledge. That's the point he's making. Just like you can't disprove sense perception with other sources of knowledge. It is its own domain. So something like that. The Mimamsa theologians will so very sophisticated arguments. I mean, I hope that point has been made. That there is nothing that can disprove the words of the Veda, and therefore, in the absence of any means of challenging their reliability, then they should be assumed to be reliable. And therefore, if they're assumed to be reliable, then one should, just as we assume sense perception is reliable and we act according to our sense perception, right? So I see my car over there, so I want to drive, so I walk over there, I don't walk some other direction, so I assume I do, I follow the dictates of sense perception in guiding my actions, right? So I'm sitting at the table here because my senses see a table. I'm not sitting at a chair. I'm not sitting over there, and so on. So therefore, just as our action is guided by other epistemological means, right? Epistemology, ways of knowing. Okay, we've discussed 3 words: sense perception, inference. These guides our behaviors. In the absence of any reason, in the absence of, I think there's a chair here, but so I see a chair and I go to sit on it and I realize it's not a chair, it's something else. Well, that's fine. A secondary perception can displace the first one. The first one was an error then. State of mind produced by the senses, it created a state of mind, but that state of mind was an error, and a subsequent perception replaces that with correct knowledge. So that is the case with sense perception, so it is the case with words. that words produce knowledge in the mind. We hear something, it produces an image in the mind. We have to assume that image is correct, unless there's subsequent words that disprove it, or another form of knowledge. Likewise with the words of the Vedas. But what words are going to disprove the Vedic rituals? How are you going to disprove that? They say you perform the Vedic ritual and the cosmos is perpetuated. How do you disprove that? The cosmos is perpetuated, right? You start off with the presupposition that if you do what is perpetuating the universe? What's perpetuating the universe? Vedic ritual. How do you disprove that? Because the Brahmins are doing the Vedic ritual every day, so they're going to say, well, look, we're perpetuating the universe. It's not quite as simple as, or as foolish as that may sound the way I just presented it. These Brahman Mimamsa were very, very serious philosophers and made very significant contributions to language, to epistemology, how do we know things, and to linguistics, and especially in those areas. Okay, so they were realists, right? There's a real world out there because the words of the Veda are real, so those words have real meanings, and that means they have real objects that they refer to, and that means those objects must be real. So their ontology is very similar to Nyaya, and if you look on page 123, instead of 7 categories, they have 5, but we don't need to worry about that. They don't accept individuators, but they accept substances, quality, action, universals. They accept the universals, which Buddhists don't. They'll critique that. They can say, the Buddhists would say, how can there be a universal? If a universal is of red, is abiding in my red shirt and in the red car, well, in that case, it's residing in 2 places. Either it's completely residing in my red car, in which case it's not abiding in the red shirt, so then the shirt isn't red. Either you say the universal is abiding in one thing, but if you say it's abiding in 2 or more things, then you're saying it has parts, because part of it's in the red shirt, part of it's in the red car, and if it has parts, then how can it be a universal? The whole definition of a universal is something with no parts. So the Buddhists will, they want everything to be powerful arguments, of course, so they want everything to be momentary and infinitely reducible. They don't accept universals, but the Mimamsas do. Okay, and a last comment I make, perhaps, about the Mimamsas is that, well, and going back to Bhartrahari, if the universe really is vibrational, and you know what does physics say nowadays? Isn't string? I'm not trying to say they're saying the same thing, but I just want to suggest that it's not such an absurd idea, because after all, physics talks about strings now as possibly the latest candidate for irreducible aspect of reality, right? The string theory, perhaps you've heard about it. I don't know very much about it at all, so if I make any mistakes here, yeah, you can email me and correct me, or I'm not a physicist. But from what little I've heard, little I know, they have a vibrational aspect to them. So therefore, if these so-called strings are really vibrational entities, and they're the they comprise the irreducible ingredients of reality. Well, we kind of have, what are we saying then? We're saying something like ultimate reality is vibrational, if the strings are vibrational. I'm not saying the Mimamsas are saying the same thing, but there's some kind of interesting overlap at the very least. So to say that the universe is vibrational, reality is ultimately vibrational, and then to say, well, why not call that Om? I mean, that's just a name for it, is not a ridiculous proposal by any means. So if the universe is vibrational, sounds, and then it's sort of, and the differences are just, you can think of different vibrations of different sounds, right? Our ear can pick up certain frequencies, but you can think of vibrations as sounds. Why not? And so the Sanskrit grammarians like to think of the Sanskrit alphabet, right? The ka, these are sounds. Ga, ka, nga, cha, 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 right? The alphabet I said before. So if they wanted to correlate aspects of reality with those specific sounds, that's what the grammarians did. But once we start thinking in those ways, then it's not so absurd to think that the sounds, the Vedic hymns, which are chanted during the Vedic ritual, after all, they're sounds. And if the universe is sounds, and Vedic hymns are sound, it's not illogical. We're not saying whether it's right or wrong or true or false, but it's not illogical to say something like the Vedic sounds can affect the sound the nature of the universe, which is also sonic, and what the set of sounds articulated by the priest affects the sound substrate of the universe such that it does perpetuate the universe in some sort of way, or it can make it rain certain frequencies. So this would be the logic, which I'm just trying to point out. We're not looking at these traditions as true or false, okay? We're not looking for veracity. We're looking for how human thought encountered the same world we're encountering, how thinkers in the past understood themselves and the world and their relationship with the world in a very different time and place, right? We're not looking for we're not going to say this is true and that's false. We'll never say that in this course. We'll say what we will try to do is really try to understand the logic, okay? So that we logic of these positions. It may be that we're attracted to some, maybe many people even academics become Buddhists, they become Vedantins, they become yogins and so forth. I myself am a yogin. So it may be that one does subscribe to one or more of these traditions, but that's not our objective here. We're not trying to convince anybody, but we're also not going to talk in terms of true or false. We're just going to say, well, okay, why do people think certain things, and what's the logic? And that's how you understand people. If you just reject people and say, well, they're mythological, they're primitive, then that's not understanding. What's that? That's blindness, actually. That's arrogance. That's just projecting our modern. Every culture thinks that they are the apex of human civilization. Which culture hasn't thought that historically in anywhere in the world? So we're just then, perpetuate the same arrogance, cultural arrogance, and presentism. We think that present thought is somehow superior to ancient thought. So let's resist thinking that. I suggest that's not an enlightening way to think. So what we're trying to do is really get into these traditions, look at how they debate, how they disagree with each other, and see the logic and coherence, and we'll see there's value in all of them. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the Vedas and the Mimamsas, and we'll move on to Vedanta. Let me just have a quick look to see if I've missed anything. Before we move on to Shankara, let's just read the last passage. Let's actually read Hamilton's framing of this. At the bottom of page 124, right before Shankara's non-dualism and over to 125. Last related point, she says, before moving on to Vedanta, right? This is the last point. Mimamsa, the establishing of self and world by means of cognition, right? So you cognize something. When you cognize something, when you perceive something, the act of cognition itself, in addition to the cognition, you're actually revealing the object of cognition, so that object must be real in some sort of way, and you're also revealing an agent of cognition. The very act of cognition itself is not just an isolated act of cognition, but it involves an object and involves a self. They were of primary importance to the Mimamsikas because of their belief that the Veda was eternal truth, right? That's the main thing. They're perpetuating the rituals. It was eternal truth manifested in language because the Vedas are written in words and sentences. They held to the orthodox view that the Veda had no author. Otherwise, it could be imperfect. So if something is eternal, then it stands a much better chance of being taken seriously, or at least being considered something perfect. If something is eternal, then it's true. It's eternally true. Then it's eternal. At least it's eternally real. And so therefore, that's a short step to saying it's eternally true. And if it's eternally true and real, then one has very strong grounds to do what it says. And what does the Veda say? Perform Vedic rituals. And it also, and from that, then extending from that, we have, as we said before, it's not just the rituals. We have the caste system. We have the whole civic order. The whole notion of dharma. The dharma was actually the performance of ritual, because dharma maintained the universe, right? The dharma of ritual maintained the whole universe, perpetuated the well-being of the universe, the rains, the sun, all of that was perpetuated by the sounds of the Vedic sacrifice. And then extending from that, then Dharma, then the society that upholds that Vedic ritual, and you need to have a civic order where everybody has their responsibilities, then Dharma gets to be applied to people performing their duties. So then we'll see the term Dharma then being used more in a sort of duty type sense when we get to the Gita. Anyway, back to this. They held to the orthodox view that the Veda had no author, rather it is self-existent truth, and cognizing it is an act of revealing its validity, because cognition is intrinsically absolutely reliable. Here's the point. This is the point, metaphysical point, epistemological point. When you cognize something, for Mimamsa, unless there's grounds to question it, that cognition is a priori accepted as valid. I cognize that tree. I have no reason to question that there's a tree there, unless some subsequent perception disproves it. But unless there's some other reason, there's no reason to doubt any cognition at all. So cognitions are self-validating. I think the term they used was Svatma Pramanya. Any cognition is self-validating unless there's some subsequent later reason to question it. So when we cognize the Veda, we read the Veda, we hear the hymns of the Veda, the cognition arises. There's no reason to doubt that unless there's some other means to reject it, some other later subsequent means that can challenge or undermine it or prove it erroneous. Okay, like the snake. I think it's a snake. Then I get a bit closer. See, it's a rope. The subsequent cognition disproves the first. That's error. I had a cognition of a rope. It was a real cognition. And the Mimamsa would say that was actually erroneous right from the start. Even if I go away, and I never, I think it's a snake. I go away. I don't actually go up and see it's a rope. So I walk around then for the rest of the day thinking I've seen a snake. I'm actually walking around with an error. But there's a real cognition. The cognition the cognition is real. I have no reason to doubt it unless the subsequent cognition disproves the first. And then I go back and see, okay, well, it was actually a rope, not a snake. And then the subsequent cognition disproves the first. There's no way of disproving the Veda. And so therefore, when we hear the words of the Veda, we get a cognition. We hear the words. They produce meaning in the mind. That's a cognition. That's an awareness of meaning. No reason to doubt that. Unless there is some method of doubting that, of course, for the Mimamsas, well, how can you doubt that? How can you doubt the efficacy of the ritual? Okay? So this is really they develop, actually, it sounds simplistic, but it's a pretty formidable argument. It's still being used nowadays in the philosophy of religion. The perception and how do you challenge sources of knowledge without being circular, without circular reasoning? That we actually accept perception, for example. That's usually the example that's given. As I said before, we accept perception. We don't challenge it. We don't challenge every single perception. We just assume it's true unless there's some reason to doubt it. Right? We don't go around, questioning, is this grass? Is this my car? Is this my house? Is this the front door? Are these my car? We don't do that. We just assume that these things they're a priori. They're given. That's Mimamsa's position. That cognition is a priori valid unless there's reason to doubt it. Therefore, the words of the Veda are a form of knowledge, or three forms of knowledge. One is perception, the other is words. These are words, no reason to doubt it unless there's some grounds to do so. Let's finish up her passage. It is self-existent truth, and cognizing it is an act of revealing its validity. The minute you cognize something in either of the three ways, it becomes valid. So cognition is intrinsically absolutely reliable, unless a subsequent cognition disproves it. In common with the nature of the Veda as a body of injunction. So the Vedas are, from this point of view, Vedas are reliable, they cause a cognition, no reason to question it. Vedas are injunctions. Injunctions means you must do this, that, and the other. So therefore, knowing the Vedas is itself a revelatory activity. By listening to the words, the Vedas are revealing themselves. They're creating a cognition that is intrinsically true. We have no grounds to question it. Okay? And what else is it? The self is the knower, because if we receive cognition, then that reveals the self. Remember, the Mimamsas are not interested in the self as everybody else is, because they want to liberate the self. Buddhists, Jains, Vedantins, Yogins, all the schools that we've looked at, they want to liberate the self. not Mimamsa. They are interested in the self as the agent of sacrifice, not in liberation. They do accept that when you die, if you do your rituals, you go to a celestial realm. But that's not liberation. And later traditions are going to critique that. Okay? So knowing is itself a revelatory activity, and the self, and if you know something, if there's knowledge, then there must be a knower. So the self becomes revealed in the act of cognition. When we cognize, I'll say it again, when we cognize something, we're accepting the truth of that thing, whether we cognize it through perception, through words, through inference. We know that thing, there's a cognition of that thing, even inference. I see the smoke, I infer there's fire, I have a cognition of fire. So now, that cognition in my mind, awareness of that thing in my mind, indicates that there's an object and that there's a self, a knower. So this, for Mimamsa, is related, okay, so knowing is itself a revelatory activity, and the self as knower is related to the external world, right? Because I'm related to the world, I'm the knower, and it's the known, and knowledge is relating us. So knowledge is relating me, the knower, to the known, the objects in the world, by means of such cognitive action. So all we really have is cognition. Okay, cognition then, if there's cognition, there must be a real world. As well as establishing the validity of the Veda, this position sought to privilege the knower of the Veda as the agent of the perpetuating of reality, a claim that has always been crucial to the Orthodox tradition. She's saying, well, if the Vedas are eternal and the ritual is perpetuating the universe, and the performer of the ritual has enormous power, and that power was preserved in the Brahmana caste. Actually, so this is a little bit of this is how Marx would look at. Marx looks at religion that those that create religion really are doing so to perpetuate the access to the modes of production, to use Marx's language. He was an atheist, didn't believe in a soul or anything, and so religion for him was a human construct, and it was constructed by people in order so that they could have access and control over the means of production. Well, back then, the means of production was the Vedic ritual. I'm not saying we have to apply a Marxist lens. I'm just saying that her last sentence is, it would be how a Marxist would look at this. The Brahmins are they're interested in perpetuating this point of view because they are the controller, they have the most powerful, they are the most respected in society from a sociological, from an ideological point of view. And so therefore the Brahmin caste is perpetuating the sort of ongoing security, the perpetuation of the universe. Is quite a grand claim. And therefore clearly they're invested in this. And so, Marxists would say, and that's why they just simply, they're coming up with all these arguments to preserve their status. Again, I'm not a Marxist, and but all these lenses are useful because they'll give us some point of view that has some accuracy to it. So clearly, the Brahmana caste has been privileged in Indian culture, but this is not a history class; it's a philosophy class. But of course, we can't completely overlook such things. Okay, so that's it then. Other than to say one thing, the Buddhists, of course, for them, words and names, rather than revealing objects, for them, the whole problem is words and names. Because remember, everything is momentary, interdependent. There are no things. There's no autonomous thing. There's nothing that lasts for more than no thing lasts for more than a fraction of a second. There is no thing in its own right. All so-called things are interdependent nexuses of connections. So in ultimate reality, the Buddhists, certainly Madhyamaka, well, let's speak about Madhyamaka, Sarvastivada, remember, a little bit different. There are no things. But what do we do when we use language? We invent things. So the Buddhists consider language to be actually a perpetuator of illusion. Because when we say, I see the tree, we're speaking as if there is a real, eternal, absolute, autonomous I, and there's a real object out there called a tree. So language then is, the language itself contributes to perpetuating illusion for Buddhists. And just to, and actually we may not have mentioned this, but if you go back to page 99, you'll see in the grey book, the grey box there, the calming of verbal differentiation. What does that mean? When we use the word like tree, and we say it's different from a plant. So there's a differentiation between a tree and a plant and a pot, right? And we use words, we're reifying things as if they really exist. And so the Nagarjuna here, this is Nagarjuna says we have to calm that. What does calm that mean? We have to get beyond language, because language creates this illusion, or contributes to this illusion that we are real seers and there's real objects, when remember in Buddhism and certainly in Madhyamika, only ephemeral, momentary, interdependent, infinite reducible flow of reality. Okay? Completely the opposite from Mimamsa. Mimamsa, real self, autonomous, extractable, and Sankhya as well, and yoga, Nyaya, real self, an autonomous, irreducible, doesn't have to be connected with reality, can be independent. Reality is full of reals, real things that are eternal, have their own existence. Doesn't matter if everything else disappears, the reals will remain, they're not interdependent. So you can see how the Indian thought has pretty much covered the whole spectrum, from reals to ephemerality, and we're going to see more of that as we move into Vedanta next. Okay, now we move on to Vedanta. Remember that Mīmāṃsā and Vedanta are sister schools, not because they agree on the purpose of life, nor necessarily because they agree on their metaphysics, but the reason and don't take this too seriously, this sister school business, but the reason they're sometimes grouped together is because they're both hermeneutical or exegetical traditions. That means exegesis is interpretation of sacred texts from the three sources of knowledge: words, inference, and sense perception. They're sister schools because they both accept that the words of the sacred text are the highest means of knowing. But they are interested in different parts of the Vedic canon. We remember previous lectures, it's divided into 4 sections. Mimamsas are interested in the Vedic hymns and the Brahmana ritual texts, which are all about rituals and how to perform the rituals, when to recite the mantras, and what part of the ritual, etc., etc. Highly complex information. And the Vedantins are interested in the Upanishads. And what they're interested in the Upanishads is Brahman. Okay, so the very first verse of the Vedanta Sutra. So now, the Upanishads we'll be reading next. And they are not systematic philosophical texts. They're not like the sutra traditions, very systematic, very focused on a particular goal, a particular intellectual excavation that they're engaging in. The Mimamsas are trying to systematize the ritualistic texts, provide coherence to the performance of ritual, and if there's contradiction in the text, how do we resolve that? Where do we assign primary meaning if there's contradiction, or if something is clearly metaphoric, when do we take something literally, when do we take it metaphorically? So they're engaging in all this exegesis, exegetic, and the principles of exegesis, not just random, right? Some author comes up and says, well, I think it means this, and someone, no, systematic means of how do we go about clarifying sacred texts. And their principles of exegesis are accepted by the other schools. They become principles then, not just one person's point of view. So in that sense, it becomes scientific, or certainly becomes systematic. So the Vedanta accepts those principles, but they apply them to the Upanishads. Again, the Upanishads they're not philosophical texts. They're very ancient. They're not systematic. In some places, it appears that that the Brahman and the Atman are one. In other places, it seems like there's a difference between Brahman and Atman. So that's the difference between monism, monotheism. Some places, Brahman is presented as being just impersonal, all-pervading truth, sat, that exists, chit, that is conscious, but impersonal. Other places you get verses suggest it's a being, a god, like a personal being. So as a result of these differences, and now if you're a Vedantin, again, they're sacred texts. They can't be imperfect. They can't be unsystematic. They have to be giving absolute, because they're not written by, Vedantins accept the same thing as the Mimamsas. They're not written by any human being. So they must be perfect. So then the next challenge is, well, how do we create systematic meaning?